So I know that many of you have studied computer science, and probably in your first programming course there was this little exercise on the stable marriage algorithm and trying to figure out how to match up men and women and hospitals and residents and all that. Well, today we have as our speaker Al Roth, who's the world's expert on this subject, I would say. He's written a very well-known book called The Two-Sided Matching Problems. And he's here to tell us a bit about some of his practical experience with mechanism design. So, Al.
Thanks, Al. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. So I thought I'd start with a question. Why can't the Google cafeteria serve horse meat? And it turns out there's one reason is that it's against the law in California to serve horse meat for human consumption. But the longer answer is that the reason it's against the law is a lot of Californians don't think, not only don't they want to eat horse meat themselves, they don't think you ought to eat horse meat. And this isn't a relic of some Wild West law. This was passed by referendum in 1998. About as many people voted for it as voted for Gray Davis as governor that year. So this is your fellow citizens who have opinions about what you ought to eat in the Google cafeteria. And notice there are no laws in California against eating cockroaches, right? So the problem isn't that people don't want to eat cockroaches. I mean, people don't want to eat cockroaches, so there's no need to have a law against it. People do want to eat horse meat, but there's a law against it. So one of the things I want to talk to you about today is repugnance. And I'm going to use repugnance to describe transactions that some people don't want other people to engage in. That's what I'll call a repugnant transaction. And eating cockroaches isn't repugnant in that sense, it's just disgusting. So the law of supply and demand takes care of cockroaches. But as a market designer, I occasionally have conversations in which people say to me, you can't do that about something that I propose to do. And sometimes it's repugnant. I'll tell you about some things that get that kind of reaction. Sometimes just words like unfair or inappropriate or unprofessional. So I want to think, one of the things I want to think about that I've been forced to think about as I design markets is the fact that people have ideas about transactions that mean that maybe you shouldn't do all of them. And sometimes this can be consequential. Later in the talk, I will talk to you about kidney exchange and things about kidney transplants. And notice it's a felony in the United States to knowingly acquire, receive, or otherwise transfer any human organ for valuable consideration for use in human transplantation. So if you wanted to sell me your kidney, that's a little bit like wanting to sell me horse meat in California. It's against the law. Yes?
I always like to ask questions at the beginning. Can you back up one slide?
I can.
So,
do you have another question?
Isn't essentially every transaction repugnant if there's multiple sources for a product? So wouldn't Verizon label a transaction with singular as repugnant?
I'm not trying to give an axiomatic definition here. I'm talking about kinds of transactions, mostly speaking, that have laws against them. Okay, so, but you're right, I'm not going to give you an axiomatic development of repugnance. I think it'll be clear. Later in the talk, I'll give you a list of things that people find repugnant, among them kidney sales. And loosely speaking, the way I run into this in my experience is when I propose a market design of some sort that I sometimes run into problems that stop us from designing markets the way we'd like to because some kinds of transactions are repugnant. But as an economist, as a market designer, I sort of expected to learn the other lessons I'm going to tell you about today, what kind of market failures create needs for new market designs. But I was a little surprised to learn about repugnance. But the other lessons were more the kind I expected to learn. I'm going to tell you about markets that fail because they're not thick enough. The marketplace doesn't provide thickness. It doesn't bring enough people, buyers and sellers together. Sometimes when markets get thick, they also get congested. You have a lot of buyers and sellers, and there are a lot of transactions that you have to think about, and you don't have time to think about them, to process them. And it also has to be safe in various ways. You have to be able to enter this market safely as opposed to transacting outside the market. So I'm going to tell you a bit about those kinds of market failures, including reasons why some markets don't exist at all, and what it is that market designers can do a little bit to help out. So as Hal mentioned, I've been involved a lot with medical labor markets of various sorts, and I'll tell you briefly about some contemporary work that Muriel Needley, who's sitting here, and I are doing for certain kinds of medical subspecialists these days. And then I'll also tell you about kidney exchange. I'm not going to talk today about other kinds of markets, particularly as I just learned that this is an hour talk and not an hour and a half talk. So let me tell you how some markets lose thickness. We'll get to repugnance again later. Okay? So what you'd like when you go on the labor market is to be able to consider a lot of possible jobs when you're being offered a job. And when you're hiring, when you're Google hiring people, you'd like to be able to look at a lot of computer scientists and people like that. But in some markets, and doctors were certainly one of them, employers start to compete with each other by trying to hire people earlier and earlier in advance of employment. So doctors start their employment only after they graduate from medical school. But around the early 1900s, doctors were hired after 4 years of medical school. By 1930, they were being hired around the middle of their senior year. By 1940, they were being hired 2 years before they were going to graduate. So something funny had happened in that market. And it's something that we see in contemporary markets as well. Law graduates who want to clerk for appellate court judges in recent years have been hired far in advance of graduation. And of course, what's going on is some kind of competition here. When some people start to hire early, their competitors have to hire early too. And there can be big information losses. When you hire a medical student 2 years before he graduates from medical school, you are missing a lot of information that you would like to have about your employees, right? They haven't met patients yet. And the students, of course, are also missing information that they would like to have. They haven't met patients yet. They don't know whether they want to be surgeons or whether they faint at the sight of blood. And one of the things you see as these markets become early is that the offers also become very short, so that people who are getting jobs often are faced with a single offer that they have to say yes or no before they can find out if there are any other offers. So presumably when you guys all had offers from Google, you could also wait long enough to see whether other employers wanted to hire you, and you could weigh different offers. But in many of these markets, that ability goes away. So turns out this is quite a common phenomenon. Sometimes words have entered the language. So for instance, fraternities and sororities, or social organizations on American colleges, their recruitment drives are called rush. Well, that turns out that word comes from unraveling. It turns out in the late 1800s, those organizations used to compete for seniors, and then some of them started to rush to try to recruit members earlier. And today they compete for freshmen. I'll tell you about medical specialists today. Undergraduate admissions, depending when you went to college, there have been times in the last decade when elite colleges admitted more than 50% of their entry classes in various forms of what were called early admission, that again made the market thin. Typically, if you wanted to be admitted to Princeton, say early admission, you could only apply to Princeton at the time you applied. And that stopped you from considering multiple offers for financial aid and things like that. So a lot of these markets that have unraveled, when you look at lots of these markets, a lot of them that unravel, they try to fix it by passing rules about uniform dates, and that seldom works. So they're going earlier and earlier. You look at the trade journals, and they're saying to each other, we shouldn't hire so early. This is really destructive. Let's not hire till a certain time. But that tends not to solve the problem that caused the unraveling, so it seldom serves as a solution to suggest dates. Some of the markets I'm going to tell you about have gone to centralized clearinghouses, and I'll tell you a bit about that. And in particular, the market I'm going to mostly concentrate on today has made a round trip. All of these arrows are transitions I've seen in some market that I've been involved in. So those clearinghouses, let's think a bit about what are the characteristics of a clearinghouse that can help solve that unraveling problem. And typically the property of a clearinghouse, it's the one that Hal referred to in the computer science problems, is a good clearinghouse, one that turns out to be successful in the world, is one that produces stable matching. So the way a medical clearinghouse works, the way doctors get jobs, is in their senior year of medical school now, they submit rank order lists of places they like to work, and the residency programs submit rank order lists of people who have applied to them, and then a matching is produced. And for a clearinghouse to be successful, it has to produce a matching that never has the property that you and I aren't matched to each other, but we'd both rather be matched to each other. That would give us the incentive to go outside, away from the clearinghouse, and transact. Turns out, in one of Knuth's books, maybe several of Knuth's books, they discuss the deferred acceptance algorithm. There are simple ways, fast algorithms, even for large problems, that get you stable matchings. Here's a straightforward kind of description of one. You say the students list choices and the schools, or I have students and schools here, you could say firms and workers. Each student applies to the top school on their list. The schools collect the applications. They only keep as many as they have room for, and they reject the rest. But the ones they keep, they haven't accepted yet. They're just holding them. That's why it's called a deferred acceptance algorithm. Everyone who's been rejected applies to their second choice. The schools now look at the applications they've got, the ones they held from before and the new ones that they've got. They keep the set they like the best, reject the rest, and the algorithm only stops when no new rejections are issued, which could happen either because all the offers are being held or because some students have run out of places they want to apply to. And the theorem due to Gale and Shapley is that the resulting outcome is stable. There can't be a student in a school who would both like to be matched to each other who aren't. And the proof is very simple. If I'm a student and I would rather be matched to you than to the school I'm matched to, it means you're higher on my list. If you're higher on my list, it means I applied to you before I applied to the school I'm now matched to, and you rejected me. So if I would rather be matched to you, you wouldn't rather be matched to me. Turns out an additional property of this theorem is that it's a dominant strategy for the students to state their true preferences. You can't do better than to rank the places you're applying in the order in which you'd like to work at them. So that's a property that makes it safe for students to participate in this. They don't have to engage in complicated strategic games. And loosely speaking, places that are stable, you look around the world at matching algorithms, the ones that are stable, listed in the first column, and whether they succeeded in halting unraveling in the second, mostly, not completely. Yeses in the first column are associated with yeses in the second column, and no's in the first column are often associated with no's in the second column. It turns out because there are different things going on with each of these actual markets, it's also nice to look at this in the laboratory where you have much more control and where you can definitely gain support for the hypothesis that it's a good idea to produce a stable matching. Now, in the NRMP match, the actual medical match, and in other complicated markets, the matching that has to be done is more complicated. One of the interesting problems for medical matching is there are now a lot of couples who need pairs of positions. There are some other complications as well. So actual stable matches that get used in medical clearinghouses are a little more complicated. The one that I helped design, the Roth-Parenson algorithm, is now used in lots of markets, so we've gotten lots of experience with them. The blue ones are Roth-Parenson. The one I want to tell you about is one that failed. Okay, I want to tell you a bit about the market for gastroenterologists. Most of you are too young to know what a gastroenterologist does, but just wait till you're 50. But I'm just going to talk to you about their labor market. Hal knows. I'm just going to talk to you about their labor market. They were in a match for a while, and unusually, they're in a stable match. Unusually, it failed. They departed from the stable match. I want to tell you their story and how Muriel and I helped them rejoin Clearinghouse and why they wanted to, what it is about being outside of the match that caused this failure. Okay, so who are gastroenterologists? Not what do they do, I won't tell you that. They are a subspecialty of internal medicine. So the way you get to be a gastroenterologist is you graduate from medical school, you go through the medical match, and you become an internal medicine resident, which you do for 3 years. Now, after those 3 years, you can become a gastroenterology fellow, eventually become a subspecialist, a board-certified subspecialist. But of course, you could be hired to be a gastroenterology fellow at any time during your residency. Ideally, you'd like to have most of your internal medicine residency done so you can decide whether you want to be a gastroenterologist or maybe a cardiologist or a pulmonary disease specialist or one of the other internal medicine specialties. And similarly, as a gastroenterology program director, I would like you to be able to go through as much of your residency as possible so I can figure out who are the good doctors and who aren't, because not everyone gets to be a subspecialist. Okay? So these guys had a match for 10 years. They lost it. And so consequently, Muriel and I are able to investigate what happens in the absence of a match compared to a match. And I want to tell you a bit about the timing and the timing of the market. I already told you what's going to happen there. They're going to unravel. And what that does to mobility, who matches to whom, and to wages. I won't tell you too much about wages. It doesn't do anything to wages, but there was a class action lawsuit that suggested that it did something to wages. And this is the kind of problem that as market designers we approach in lots of different ways. We approach it theoretically. We can prove theorems about this market. We can look at lots of field data. We can bring it into the laboratory. We can survey the market participants. So just incidentally, here's a bunch of papers, but Muriel Needley, Nick McKinney, Debbie Proctor are my co-authors. But what I wanted to, the reason I show you this is just to give you the idea of the kind of conversation that's involved in changing a market. So the papers in black are published in economics journals. The papers in red are published in medical journals. The papers in blue are experiments. The thing about market design is not only is there the science of what you have to do, but there's also lots and lots of explanation and persuasion and coordination. So getting markets adopted is an interesting, fun thing to do. So let me tell you what happened to timing of interviews. And what I'm showing you here is a cumulative distribution of when in the year internal medicine fellowship programs that continue to participate in the match when they interview. And what you see is they basically don't start interviewing until January. There's hardly any interviewing going on. And then they interview, they're mostly done by April, and the match is in June. Okay, these are guys who are preparing for a match in June. Unlike gastroenterology, which started to go earlier and earlier. So if you look at the time when, say, 40% of interviews had already commenced, what you see is if you're in a match subspecialty, that doesn't happen till February, more or less. But even 10 years after the match, every year the gastroenterology market was moving earlier and earlier. And loosely speaking, what was happening is because people are going earlier and earlier, and because they're making exploding offers, more or less, here's a picture of that. Here's the people who have open offers, the employers who have open offers at any moment during the year. And what you see is it's pretty dispersed. Here's a moment at which a quarter of the programs have already finished making offers, a quarter haven't started to make offers yet, and a quarter are in the midst of making offers. So if you want to be a gastroenterologist, not only do you have to decide a whole lot earlier than when you decide whether you want to be a cardiologist, but you can't even interview a lot of the gastroenterology programs at the same time. Right? So you interview in a gastroenterology program, they make you an offer, you have to say yes or no before waiting for a program that you might prefer, but that isn't going to start interviewing for a while. So it was a thin market. Here's another graph of that. At any moment, less than 40% of the employers have offers open. So there's no time at which you can go on the broad gastroenterology market. Okay, you more or less get offers when they come. And from whom do your offers come in such a market? They come from people nearby you in your hospital, in a hospital near your city. Because what this is a graph of is mobility, and from 1977 through 2004. And what you see is over time mobility grew. Here's the start of the match, and here's basically the end. But that after the match it collapsed. It started to go way down, and what's happening here, what you're seeing here is you're less likely to change hospitals, you're less likely to change cities, you're less likely to change states than you used to because you don't get many offers, and instead of having a big national market, the market for gastroenterologists collapsed into lots of local markets. So, presented with this evidence, the gastroenterologists got ready to start a match again. And the question was, and I mentioned the coordination. There's a lot of different organizations of gastroenterologists. So to agree on anything, lots of people have to be persuaded. Okay? But they agreed to start a match again. And then the question was, but how should they do it? What they wanted to do is they wanted to move the hiring date back later a year. So we're all in this together. We're all gastroenterology directors, and we say to ourselves, this is crazy the way we've been hiring, let's wait a year. And we all agree to do it. Then we go back to our shops, and everyone says, how do I know you're going to wait? Right? We've all been hiring a year too early. We've all agreed to wait a year. How are we going to do this? I'm afraid that you're going to hire people early and lock them up, and I'll wait for the match, and the good guys will be gone. And we started to get emails. Our gastroenterology colleague who did the real work and took the lead in organization is Debbie Proctor. And she sent us an email where she said, I'm getting 3 or 4 emails per day basically on that subject saying, I want to make sure my competition is in the match and that they don't cheat. The question is how to do this, how to design the market so that everyone has confidence that they can all participate and not suffer from not cheating. So what the gastroenterology professional organizations did is they adopted a policy. They didn't feel they had the authority. They didn't have the ability to enforce any action on gastroenterology fellowship programs. So here we are, we're all gastroenterology fellowship directors, and sitting together in our professional organization, we all say, there's no way to stop you from making early offers. And so what we propose to them is that they empower the applicants, the residents, and say, if someone makes you an early offer, they shouldn't have done that. They're a bad guy. And you can accept the early offer and later turn it down. And it turns out some of you may be familiar with that policy because that's a policy that American graduate schools adopt for their graduate programs. If you get a letter from the Department of Economics at Harvard admitting you to the Ph.D. program, it comes with a policy formulated by what's called the Council of Graduate Schools, which is also signed by hundreds of American universities, all the universities you've heard of. And what it says is you don't have to answer us before April 15th. And if someone else, and everyone has agreed that they won't ask you to answer offers of admission before April 15th, but if someone else asks you to answer, you may say yes. And later, you may change your mind as long as you do it by April 15th. And so what this assured students is that they wouldn't be cut out of the market. They could keep going on interviews. And it of course made it very unprofitable to make those early exploding offers because you could no longer lock up the candidates. If they got a better offer later, they could take it, yeah.
But then won't employers be worried that, so you don't have that problem, but employers now be worried that like an offer they make will be beaten by a later batch?
Absolutely. So it's going to make it unprofitable to make early offers, and rather you should wait to go through the match. Okay? So here's the match. The policy says the policy that they adopted says offers you accept in the match are binding. Offers you accept early are not. Okay? So here's the resolution, and again, you notice 4 professional organizations have to agree to it. So once again, there's lots of coordination and persuasion that goes on. It says the resolution concerns the conditions surrounding fellowship offers. The general spirit is that each applicant should have an opportunity to consider all programs for making a decision and be able to participate in the match. And it therefore seeks to create rules that give both programs and applicants the confidence that applicants and positions will remain available to be filled through the match and not withdrawn in advance of it. And then what it says is, if some applicants may be persuaded or coerced to make commitments prior to the match, they can nevertheless participate in the match by resigning the accepted position. Okay, so they can't enforce rules on their colleagues, on the other gastroenterology fellowship directors, but what they're saying here is we can sure take the fun out of making early offers because you won't be able to capture the good candidates. Yeah.
I'm confused about sort of a jurisdictional question, which is if they can't enforce that the participating institutions cannot make early offers, how could they override the contractual commitment of a student that agreed to an early offer?
Right. So there is this question of interfering with contracts, and the AGA's lawyers got involved, and we got involved a little too. And our advice was of the following practical sort. We said, you're not going to have a lot of broken contracts. If these are your policies, you're not going to see many early offers, and this problem will go away. And that's by and large what happened. In other words, because remember, most of the fellowship directors want to wait for the match. My problem is not that I want to make early offers. My problem is I'm worried that you're going to make early offers and tie up the good guys so that I better make them offers before you do. But now that I'm assured that I have a reasonable chance of being able to talk to them, there's always the question of if you decided to sue some medical resident and require him to perform. None of these went to court, and indeed, when the match operated, it operated very well. In other words, this made the early offers go away. It gave the employers the confidence that the match would work. Once you get enough people using the match, now it's easy for applicants to turn down early offers because there's a big, thick market coming. The problem was in that transition when you sort of say, gee, everyone's always hired 2 years in advance. You've just made me an offer 2 years in advance. It looks pretty good. I'd love to wait, but if no one waits, I'm not waiting for anything. But what we did is we helped make the market thick. We helped make the match thick, and it's now run through its second year as well. We haven't analyzed those data yet, but maybe this weekend. All right. Now, just incidentally, we're talking to orthopedic surgeons these days, and they have very similar problems, almost identical, but some of the orthopedic surgeons don't think they can use the same solution. They think that for other reasons, like not the legalistic ones, but the repeated game ones, they think that orthopedic surgeons can't turn down fellowship offers that they've already accepted. Okay, that the world is too small. If I say to you, I'm coming, I just have to come. On the other hand, they believe that they can take punitive action. They think their professional organizations are more powerful. They think that they can stop you from presenting papers at academic meetings if you're a bad actor in the market. So they're now exploring those things. Federal judges who hire law clerks, they have the worst of both worlds. Law students can't break promises they make to federal judges, to appellate judges. And the judicial conferences can't enforce anything on the judges. So right now they're having the full set of market problems without an apparent solution in sight. That is, the same nice clearinghouse about which we can prove the same theorems isn't going to work for the judges until they solve some of their other problems. Let me just, before I move on to other things, let me tell you what it's like to be on the market, to be a clerk for an appellate judge. Okay, they have exploding offers. So we have a paper where we survey people and we get some quotes. I just want to show you one, which is almost like a haiku about the job market. Someone said the following. He said, I received the offer via voicemail while I was in flight to my second interview. The judge actually left 3 messages. First, to make the offer. Second, to tell me that I should respond soon. Third, to rescind the offer. It was a 35-minute flight. Okay? So judges are tough, you know, and there's no judicial body that can police them. So until judges can't rescind the offers they make, it's going to be very hard, and especially since law students can't break promises to judges. You know, in economics, we're fond of talking about how you can't get efficient outcomes if you can't make binding contracts, but the market for law clerks is one where they can promiscuously make binding contracts because all the verbal contracts are binding. And so they have a lot of problems having to do with that. They have some similar things. All right, let me switch gears now. Tell you about a different set of very different markets, not labor markets, where thickness was also the issue. And I want to talk to you about kidney transplants. And that's sort of how I began, because you remember the National Organ Transplant Act says you can't buy a kidney. Okay, so there are 70,000 people waiting for a cadaver kidney in the United States, but we only get to do about 11,000 operations each year. So there's a real shortage in supply. And it's costly to wait. So about 4,000 people die each year. And dialysis gets less and less easy to go through. So it's a really costly wait. This is, you know, end-stage renal disease is a terrible disease. But it's also possible to do live donor transplants. And that's because each of you has 2 kidneys. And if you're as healthy as you look, then you can stay healthy with just 1 kidney. So if someone you love needs a kidney, you could give them a kidney. Can't sell them a kidney, that's a felony. Okay? But sometimes you can't give them a kidney. You're healthy enough, but you can't give the person you want to a kidney. It could be because blood types are incompatible, or it could be because of immunological incompatibility. So the chance, if I didn't know my own blood type, the unconditional chance that you can take my kidney is about 50%. But the chance that my wife can take my kidney is only about 30%, and that's because we're parents. And in the course of childbirth, her immune system may have become exposed to some of the proteins that our children get from me and not from her. And if she already has antibodies against those proteins, then they'd be waiting to attack my kidney if it showed up. So sometimes I can't give to who I want to give to, and you can't give to who you want to give to. And it opens up the possibility of exchange. Maybe I could give a kidney to your patient, and you could give a kidney to my patient. So That's what I want to talk to you about as a market design problem. And once again, it's a long conversation in both medical journals and economics journals. And my economics collaborators are Tayfun Sunmez and Utku Unver, and my medical collaborators are Susan Seidman and Frank Delmonico and Michael Reese. And we've had some success, and I'm going to tell you about the details, but there are now regional programs for kidney exchange, and the Congress has slowly but just started to pass legislation which says that kidney paired donation, that's the polite word for kidney exchange, shall not be considered to involve the transfer of a human organ for valuable consideration. So in case you were worried about whether this violates the National Organ Transplant Act by, here's new legislation which says that it does not. So by the end, I'm going to get back to repugnance. The question is, why not? And what's going on. But first, let me just tell you about the sort of technical problems of designing a kidney exchange. Okay, so just incidentally, for the economists in the audience, Jevons talked about the double coincidence of wants, right? The trouble with kidney exchange is, we've got a kidney that we can use for exchange. I want to give a kidney to someone, but I can't. But I'd give a kidney to your patient if you'd give a kidney to my patient. It's only going to work if my patient can use the kidney you've got and your patient can use the kidney I've got. Okay? And Jevons sort of says, the only way you can solve problems like that's going to be a rare event. That's what you need money for. That's why we don't have just barter, right? If you could buy a kidney, you'd be all set. Then you'd take the money and you'd sell a kidney, and then you'd take the money and go buy an appropriate kidney. Of course, it's illegal to do that. And what I'm going to propose to you is that computer technology allows us to build clearinghouses that perform some of the functions that traditional monetary markets perform. So let me give you the background on how this works. Notice there are now more living donors than there are deceased donors in the US. Remember, there are, where am I? There are still a lot fewer living transplants than there are deceased donor transplants, but that's because deceased donors donate both kidneys. Okay, so there are more living donors. There are lots more unrelated donors than there used to be. So it used to be before immunosuppressive drugs got good, you could only get, well, the first transplants were from identical twins, okay, back in the 1950s. But it turns out that while an identical SIB transplant has the best survival rate after 10 years, and deceased kidneys the worst, you just can't see the difference between non-identical SIBs, non-identical on a vector of 6 proteins, and unrelated people, right? So my kidney is just as good for you as your brother's kidney. So this is really going to open up the possibility of exchange. Now, there's a whole elaborate national system for allocating deceased donor kidneys. But live donor kidneys are completely decentralized. We're trying to create some clearinghouses. The way live donor works is someone you love has kidney disease, you suggest that maybe you could give them a kidney, you go with them to their nephrologist, they take a blood sample, maybe they rule you out right then, they say, sorry, incompatible blood types, or maybe you get further down the line. But if you're incompatible, mostly what used to happen is you just vanished. You're not a patient, so you don't have a chart. You went home and no one ever knew about you, and your patient went on the deceased donor list. But in just a very few cases, and this is how we could tell it wasn't repugnant, some exchanges happened. So we've got 14 transplant centers in New England, and there were only 5 exchanges before 2004. And at least one of those was arranged by the people themselves. That is, it was spouses who met in the waiting room of a dialysis center, and they had a conversation in which they said, what's your story? And one of them says, my spouse is in there, and I would have given a kidney, but I'm blood type B and he's blood type A. And the other one said, that's funny, we're just the opposite. So exchanges can happen, but because the market wasn't thick, because it was hard to look for a counterparty to that trade, very, very few of them were happening. Johns Hopkins in Baltimore was a leader in those early days. So what we want to do, for a start, is we just want to assemble a database of incompatible patient-donor pairs. That is, if you're interested in a trade, who else could you trade with? And then we want to find efficient ways to match them. And we want to deal with it in a way that gives good incentives. Okay, this is the kind of thing Hal worries about in auctions all the time. We want people to participate safely. So, because I have less time than I thought, let me not tell you too much about incentives, except to say one of the incentive things we do is all the surgeries are performed simultaneously, so that after you've gotten a kidney, your donor shouldn't become unavailable to give a kidney. So I'm actually the guy in the yellow robe there trying to make sure no one hands me anything. And here's a kidney, and behind me, off screen, you can't see it, is an operating room just steps away where that kidney has just been taken out in a nephrectomy. And here is the transplant, here's the patient right there. And this, and in another pair of operating rooms is the donor for that patient giving to the recipient for this donor. Okay, so 4 simultaneous surgeries are going on. That's cumbersome. Okay, here's another incentive problem that we have, that as we've started to get kidney exchange going, sometimes when we talk to transplant centers, they don't want to tell us about all their incompatible patient-donor pairs. They don't want to announce to us all the people who can engage in trade. Let's see what's going on there. Supposing transplant center A has 2 incompatible pairs, but they could exchange them in-house. They could do it themselves. Well, we'd hate to have them do that, because supposing this is what the whole graph looks like in our little bit of exchange, if they exchange A1 with A2, they get 2 transplants. Okay, donor from A1 gives to the patient of A2, donor from A2 gives to the patient from A1. But if they were to tell us about those, and it turns out we can also exchange pair A1 with B and pair A2 with C, then we'll get 4 transplants. But of course, the reason they might not tell us about it is maybe the graph looks like this. There is no C. And if they tell us about A1 and A2, we're going to say to them, patient B is high priority. Patient B is a child. The exchange we want to do is A1 with B. And then they're going to say, gee, you know, we could have done A1 with A2 if we just hadn't told you about it. Okay, so in order to get full participation, this is now a real issue, we have to basically promise, I think, we haven't done this yet, we have to basically promise Transplant Center A that if you show us patients A1 and A2, we'll make sure they get transplanted. They might get transplanted like this, which would be great, but if the situation is like this, we'll make sure A1 and A2 both get transplanted, even if patient B, even if the child does not. And this turns out to be a very difficult discussion to have with doctors for reasons of sort of repugnance. You know, they sort of say, gee, you know, these A1 and A2, they just accidentally happen to be at the same transplant center. They're not especially deserving. There's this child. And of course, what the economists say is, you know, the child isn't going to be transplanted unless Transplant Center A tells us about A1 and A2. And then there's a chance. But if they don't tell us about them, then they have higher priority than that child, even if we've never formally said that they should. And so again, this is the kind of question of how to design the clearinghouse to not only get the transplants you want, but get all the patients that you want so that you can do the best transplants. Okay, so let me tell you a bit about what makes kidney matching efficient. First, let me tell you about blood for a moment. So there are 4 blood proteins, A, B, and O. So you are blood type A if you have protein A. You're blood type B if you have protein B. You're AB if you have both of them. And you're O if you have neither of them. In some languages, instead of O, that's called 0. That makes it clearer. Right? It means you don't have any of the blood proteins. And the rule is you can't receive a kidney from someone who has a blood protein that you don't have, because you've got antibodies to all the proteins you don't have. So type O kidneys can go into any patient, but type O patients can only take type O kidneys. Okay, so they're going to be the most vulnerable patients, the ones hardest to match. Okay, and type O donors are going to be in short supply, not because there's a shortage of type O donors in the population. There's plenty of type O donors in the population, but because type O donors are seldom incompatible with the person they want to give a kidney to. If someone loves you who is type O and they want to give you a kidney, they're going to be able to unless you have an immunological incompatibility. Okay? Now, the immunological incompatibilities are these preformed antibodies to a vector of 6 proteins that matter for kidney transplantation. So it turns out, when we think about exchanges, that when we initially talked to doctors, we said, let's do exchanges of any size. Let's find what's efficient. And they said to us, you know, no, you know, that may sound good in you know, at Harvard, but in the hospital, remember, when we do a two-way exchange, it takes 4 operating rooms. When we do three-way, it takes 6. If you wanted us to do a 4-way exchange, it would take 8 operating rooms. You know, a 10-way exchange would take 20 simultaneous operating rooms and surgical teams. You know, it's impossible. So we went back and we figured out how to do everything that you could do under the constraint that you could only do two-way exchange. But since then, we've been explaining and helping build the infrastructure to do bigger exchanges, because it turns out if you want to be efficient, you need to do both 2- and 3-way exchanges. You don't need to do more than that. And what's the story? Well, let's look at some little examples. And here are patient-donor pairs. Here's the patient blood type, which is called the ABO blood type because of the 2 proteins. So here's an A patient with a B donor. The reason they can't, the reason they're incompatible is the A patient can't take the B kidney. The O patient can't take the A kidney. Here's a rare O donor, right? A B patient can take the O blood type. These guys are incompatible because of some immunological issue. Similarly, here I've noticed this A patient has a positive cross-match, can't take this A kidney. So if we can only do two-way exchanges, then we just get these 2 transplants. We put this O kidney into this O patient in return for this B kidney. But if we could do 3-way exchanges, we could take that rare O donor and create a chain where this O goes to this O patient, this A goes to this A, and this B goes to this B. And similarly, we could put this AA pair in between these 2 who have the positive cross-match. So when you can do 3-way, you can get a lot more transplants. But 4-way doesn't get you much more. And one of the reasons 4-way doesn't get you much more is AB blood type is very rare in the United States. So you can prove some theorems about this, which say that because there are only 4 blood types, you can get all the exchanges done with no more than 4-way cycles. But the conditions on which you need that the 4-way are very rare. So in fact, you get almost all the, if you just go 2-way exchange in a pool of 25, you get about 36 transplants. You get 45% if you can go 3-way, and only 47% if you can go 4-way, and only 48% if you can go higher, where the larger ones are just due to immunological idiosyncratic things. And the bigger the pool, here the numbers would be 49%, 59%. This jump between 2-way and 2 plus 3-way won't go away, but hardly anything comes extra if you do larger exchanges. So it's really worthwhile to invest in the infrastructure to be able to do 3-way exchanges, and we're starting to do that, both in New England and in the Alliance for Paired Donation.
Does this take into account frequency of the AB types?
Yes, absolutely. This is on American patient population. So I think there are places in the world where AB is more common, but these are American patients. They're only about 4%, a little under 4% ABs. Now, there are some other cool things you can do that make exchange more efficient. For instance, every now, I say cool things. When I talk to doctors, they are always sort of upbeat, but it's often very odd to have these conversations with transplant surgeons. You talk about some patient who's very ill and maybe a child patient who needs a heart or something like that, and then they say, and then things were looking really bad, and then by a stroke of good luck, a heart became available. You go, ooh. But so let me tell you some good things that can be done with exchange. Sometimes you've got this patient and donor who are an incompatible patient-donor pair. Sometimes their need becomes urgent. And one of the things that they can do, so they can no longer wait for exchange. But what they can do is, at least in New England, this isn't allowed everywhere in the US, but in the New England program for kidney exchange, we allow this. The donor can give to a patient who's been waiting for a long time for a deceased donor kidney, so someone who has high priority on the deceased donor queue, and in return receive priority on the deceased donor queue. So basically what the patient gets is very close to the next available kidney that's good for him from a deceased donor. Okay? And in return, they donate a live kidney. Now, the reason those are a little complex issues is, of course, there's not one deceased donor queue. There are different queues, for instance, for different blood type kidneys. And typically, this patient isn't waiting for the same kind of kidney that this patient is waiting for. That's why this patient can take this kidney and this patient can't. So it's a little bit that the patient steps in front of the queue, but it's a different queue than patient 3 was waiting on. Well, we can do better than that now. We've got this pool of people waiting for exchange. So instead of donor 1 giving immediately to someone on the deceased donor queue, they can give to another patient-donor pair and have them give to the deceased donor queue, and in return get priority on the deceased donor queue. So that's a way of getting another transplant. Okay? We also start to have non-directed donors. Okay? A saintly thing you can do is decide to give a kidney to someone you don't know. And what had been typical practice in the United States was to have a non-directed donor give to someone on the deceased donor queue, someone who'd been waiting for a long time. And now instead in New England, we can multiply that gift by having someone give to someone in the exchange pool who gives to someone else in the exchange pool who gives to someone on the deceased donor queue. Okay? And there's a pretty abstract way of looking at it. This is what it looks like in the flesh. This is a non-directed donor queue that involved 6 people. Now, the reason it only involves 6 people is all the surgeries were done simultaneously. But with a non-directed donor, we can start asking, maybe we can relax simultaneity. Okay, so let's think about that. So when we started talking about this just in a theoretical way, we said, if something goes wrong in a non-directed donor chain, maybe it's not as bad as if something goes wrong in an exchange. So let's think about that. Here's a standard exchange, which we do simultaneously. What's the issue? Well, here's pair 1, donor 1 and recipient 1, getting ready to trade with donor 2 and recipient 2. Supposing we didn't do the surgery simultaneously, and donor 2 donates a kidney to recipient 1. The surgeries are done. And now, for whatever reason, donor 1 becomes unavailable or unwilling. Donors become unavailable. It's not just a question of unwilling. One of the things is donors sometimes become pregnant, for example, and they can't give a kidney. So if you were going to wait a week, you might flunk the test that allowed you to give a kidney that you had passed a week earlier. Well, if this were to happen, if we did this non-simultaneously, recipient 2 is really harmed here. Recipient 2 didn't get the planned kidney, but also recipient 2's donor has already given a kidney. Okay, so it's bad for the donor, and it's bad for recipient 2, who can no longer take part in exchange. But now suppose we start a chain with a live, living non-directed donor, okay, as in that picture I just showed you. Well, what we'd like is, the non-directed donor gives to recipient 1, recipient 1's donor gives to recipient 2, and maybe and so forth. If it breaks down, well, that's really bad for recipient 2, but not nearly as bad as it was here, because recipient 2 is just where he was before the non-directed donor came forward, can still take part in exchange next month when we run the next match run. So we started to say to ourselves, if they don't need to be simultaneous, maybe we can make them longer. Maybe we can do non-simultaneous transfers where social workers do some of the work of identifying bridge donors who will, with high likelihood, be prepared to give a kidney in the next week for one that their partner got this week. And we've actually started doing this. There's a, Mike Reese likes to call them never-ending altruistic donor chains. Mike Reese is the surgeon in charge of the Alliance for Paired Donation, a Midwestern kidney exchange consortium. And there's one that's going on. It started in July, and it was when I prepared this slide, it was at transplant number 4 with transplant number 5 on the way. So the exchanges are no longer limited to just 3, which was 6 operating rooms. Okay, other ways we could make things more efficient. Well, we need a national exchange, right? Especially for patients with lots of antibodies, right? So the way we talk about your antibody load is we talk about how highly sensitized you are. If you have a 90% antibody load, what that's supposed to mean is 90% of the kidneys that are blood type compatible you wouldn't be able to take. So, of course, if there's only a couple of dozen people you can exchange with, you might not get a kidney. But if there were thousands, you'd get a kidney. Okay, so we're working on a national exchange. The legislative barriers are falling, but it's amazing how many barriers remain. It turns out, coordinating transplant centers is very difficult. They all are accustomed to operating with great autonomy. Another thing that would increase the thickness of the market is to offer exchange not just to incompatible patient-donor pairs, but also compatible ones who might benefit from exchange. So supposing I need a kidney and someone wants to give it to me. Well, the likely people who would give me kidneys are, as it happens, many of them are around my age. So they're middle-aged kidneys, which would be great for me, and I would be essentially cured. But it would be better, but a younger kidney is better. Supposing you know, a young person in the audience need a kidney, and you have a young, 25-year-old donor, but you're incompatible. So your donor is great, but you can't take your donor's kidney. Well, maybe we could exchange, right? So I'd get the younger kidney, and you'd get a kidney that works for you. So it turns out, one of the reasons that would be very powerful to allow is that would remove the shortage of O donors. There's no shortage of O donors in the world. There's just a shortage of O donors who are incompatible with their intended recipient. So this is something that is not yet really possible in the United States, but is on the agenda, how to make the market work better. Again, that's something we started to talk about in 2004 and 2005. We're still talking about it. I mentioned the enabling legislation, so I'm just summing up here on kidneys. We need to be able to do three-way as well as two-way exchanges. We're doing that. These are all things to make the market thicker, and we'd like to open up kidney exchange to more pairs. And all of this is done in the shadow, remember how I began, is the fact that monetary exchange is repugnant. So as a market designer, I've started to want to understand repugnance better. So let me end my talk by telling you a little bit about repugnance. I wrote a paper called Repugnance as a Constraint on Markets, right? There are markets we don't see. And the thing about repugnance is it changes. It changes in time and in place. I started off and I said it's illegal to sell horse meat for human consumption in California. Well, the horse meat it's not illegal in California to kill a horse to make pet food and feed it to your dog. But actually that happens very little because the price of horse meat is set by the fact that it's highly desirable in Europe for human consumption. So American slaughterhouses in Texas that slaughter horses export the horse meat. It's very little sold in the United States. And you can easily check this out. If you search for sort of horse meat on the internet, you find two kinds of sites. One site is full of how it's awful to eat horse meat, and the other is full of recipes. And and those are mostly in Italian. So let me tell you a little bit about repugnance. Repugnance can change over time. I've already suggested that organs are a problem, but cadavers were an enormous problem for a long time for medical schools. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Harvard campus, but the medical school at Harvard isn't in Cambridge at the main campus, it's in Boston. The reason it's in Boston is that the city of Boston promised to make all unclaimed cadavers available to the Harvard Medical School for anatomy classes if they would locate in Boston. It turns out in the mid-1800s in England, the only way for medical schools to get cadavers was to deal with grave robbers who were called resurrection men. And the nice thing about, one of the nice things about the internet is you can go read the early issues of the medical journal The Lancet. And in some of the very earliest issues, the editorials, one of the editorials struck me. It says, a reliable resurrection man has just been arrested and sentenced to transportation to Australia. What are we going to do now? So there were real problems in the market for cadavers, whereas not too long ago, I took my children to a Body Worlds exhibit that was full of pretty repugnant, cadavers posed in artful poses so that you could learn about their anatomy. It may not be unrepugnant, but it's certainly not illegal anymore. So that's something that was repugnant that became less repugnant, but it also goes the other way. Think about indentured servitude and slavery, right? So there used to be markets for slaves in the United States. It used to be that one of the common ways to buy passage across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe was to sell yourself into indentured servitude, okay? Well, the Constitution now says that involuntary servitude is illegal in the United States, and that means I can't sell myself. I can't sign a labor contract that promises I won't quit my job, right? You can't sign a contract with Google that says for 5 years, no matter what Google does, you will work for Google. That's not a legal labor contract in the United States because we find involuntary servitude repugnant. These repugnances change, where the role of mercenary soldiers in armies seems to be changing as we speak. Interest on loans, used to be repugnant in much of Christendom, right, in Western Europe. Mostly no longer repugnant, right? Max Weber wrote a set of essays called Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, in which he talked about how, what makes the capitalist economy possible is the changing repugnance on earning money. the headings here are meant to be big things. So human remains, labor markets, finance, reproduction, and sex. You can pay a lot of money if you want to adopt a child, but you can't buy the baby from the birth mother. Okay, that's against the law almost everywhere. So, not to say it doesn't happen, but you can't do that. But everything else can be purchased. All the other reproductive services. So certainly eggs. In Massachusetts, we have a funny law. You can, of course, there are ads all the time in the Harvard Crimson asking for eggs from women of certain, demographic and scholarly characteristics, and you can sell eggs in Massachusetts at a high price for fertility, but not for research. Eggs used for research may not be purchased in Massachusetts. Okay. Other examples I could talk about. Let me just suggest that some things that aren't repugnant by themselves are repugnant when money is added. Okay, so interest on loans. No one ever objected to people loaning money to other people. They objected to charging interest. Payments to birth mothers. Adoption is a wonderful thing, but purchasing a child might not be. Prostitution. Sex and love are wonderful things, but we object to markets for them. And of course, purchasing organs for transplantation. Everyone thinks it's a great thing if you give your friend or loved one a kidney, but it's a felony if you sell one. And we can all identify with the idea that money is inappropriate in some circumstances. Hal's laughing because he can tell that the man in the tie is an economist. But we all understand why the joke is funny. If I come to your house for dinner, I can bring a bottle of wine. I can invite you to dinner at my house in return. I can offer to take you out to dinner and buy you a dinner at a restaurant. But I certainly can't, at the end of the dinner, say, that was great. That would have cost me $75 easy at a fine restaurant. Let me pay you, right? Because when you invite me to dinner, you're offering friendship. And when I offer to pay for it, I'm suggesting that I didn't understand about your offer for friendship. So I'm somehow transgressing one kind of transaction with another. So psychologist Phil Tetlock calls these taboo trade-offs. And one of the reasons I thought I'd talk about repugnance here is, when I think about Google, I wonder whether repugnance could be an issue, for instance, in questions of data privacy, right? So, it's okay, if Amazon recommends books to me based on my past book purchases, but I wonder if it's equally okay, or certainly this was an issue when Gmail started, whether it's equally okay if you recommend me books based on the content of my emails. So let me get a sense of the audience just before I sort of close up about transactions. And I want to know whether you're willing to contemplate, for a start, a market for living donor, living vendor kidneys. How many people would be prepared to have a suitably regulated market for kidneys? Keep your hands up, please. Okay, so a lot of you, not everyone, but a lot. Keep your hands up. How about eyes?
Aye.
Okay, pretty much same people eyes. How about hearts? There's some hesitation there. Okay, a lot of you guys stay up with hearts, but so I think you're tougher than many of the groups I've talked to. A lot of the hands come down at hearts. Is that a question, or you just want to see what the next item is and you'll vote for that too? Okay. So, yeah, children, there you go. So, for many of you, not all of you, but many of you found something repugnant about at least one of these. Okay, so that's something to think about because it's often difficult to understand other people's repugnance for things you're willing to do. All right, so let me end. Repugnance can be a real constraint. It can affect what markets we see, what market designers can do. A lot of my colleagues at Harvard and elsewhere do what we call behavioral economics. We think about how people can be better modeled than is perfectly rational. And normally we think of them as individuals. But this idea of repugnance sort of takes us more into sociology a little bit. We think about what whole markets don't we see. So not just how do you make choices, but what choices do you not even get to make because some markets don't exist. You have very little opportunity in the United States to sell your kidney, even if you wanted to. And in terms of market design, we need to keep markets thick. We need to keep them uncongested. We need to keep them safe and reasonably simple to participate in. These are all things that, when I talk to Hal about what he's thinking about, he's partly thinking about these things when he thinks about ad auctions. And some kinds of transactions are repugnant. That's what I've learned so far. And the thing about designing markets for an economist is it gives us a different way of looking at them. Okay, we're not just looking at them at the aggregate. They're not just the confluence of supply and demand. We have to understand them in enough detail to really understand how they work, and so that we can not just understand them, but can fix them when they're broken. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions if anybody would like to ask them. There's a question.
So, two quick organ donation or organ exchange questions. So, how much does the exchange, presumably an efficient exchange market actually increases the overall pool of donors?
Yes.
So can you quantify
So
that?
we don't know. Right now, medical privacy laws are pretty strict. So right now there are 70,000 people on the waiting list for a deceased donor organ. And what I would love to be able to do is write each of them a letter and say, maybe before you entered the waiting list for deceased, there was someone who was willing to give you an organ but couldn't.
So the belief, though, presumably, is that it will increase the supply relative to the demand compared to what we currently have,
Absolutely.
but less than an organ market would.
Yes.
Okay. And so,
although there's a lot of debate on organ market, there are some people who think that the organ market would crowd out some of the altruistic giving, and that there could be problems there.
Okay, so that's that's essentially my other question, which is, the proponents of the exchanges, both the researchers and the organizations that are in favor of them, right? Some subset of them find the market idea repugnant, presumably, and some subset of them don't find the market idea repugnant.
You got it.
So for the ones that don't find the market idea repugnant in and of itself, do you think the sort of favoring of the exchange idea will cause them to not be in support of market ideas because they've put all this investment into the exchange?
Well, just speaking for myself, if there's a better solution, I'd love to see it. This is a terrible disease. But in terms of speaking about repugnance, I think of repugnance as a real fact of economic life. So the better things that might come along, perhaps a market could solve this problem, but maybe someone will solve the problem of immunosuppressing the reaction to pig kidneys, so we'd be able to grow, animal kidneys. And I don't know which will come first. There's no reason to think pig kidneys are coming soon. That's a really hard problem. Repugnance may be a hard problem too. Think how long it took, to charge interest on loans and things like that.
I'm just wondering if there's a single thing that repugnance can be attributed to, like a root cause. You gave the example of Gmail and ads and so on. I'm prepared to believe that, for example, people don't find Google scanning emails for spam filtering repugnant because it's a net benefit. But ads, to most people, they'd rather not have them than have them. Can it be analysed down to a root cause that you say, people find things repugnant because it's a net negative to them, or?
So I am a little skeptical about this. When I see things that are repugnant, I often find things that to me appear extremely similar but are not. So I'm not optimistic, certainly, that I will be able to find a root cause of repugnance.
When you started describing the gastroenterological market and you showed the figure how it collapsed and was revived again, I seem to notice that even after the revival, about 10% remained out of it. How could it go together? Would it still go together?
So we think that that in the second year of operation there are fewer going to be out, but sometimes there are in a market, even with a similar name like that, sometimes there are programs that are really fishing in a different pool, right? So that they only hire researchers rather than clinicians or something like that. So I think that, so for instance, we've done a match for New York City high schools, and about 100,000 kids are matched each year. And under their old system, they sort of failed to match adequately around 30,000. But we still, under a new, modern, good system, failed to match about 3,000. And some proportion of those 3,000 are kids who, for one reason or another, don't submit a rank order list. When you've got the 100,000 kids, there's some small percentage that, for mysterious reasons, you look into it, some of them are involved in the criminal justice system and aren't available. Some of them are in homes that don't support them adequately. So I don't know what the answer is right now about the 10% missing. I think it'll be down to about 5%, but there'll always be some small percent that don't participate and that make their living in some way that we don't know about.
One more question.
One reason that I didn't raise my hand and say that I was okay with the kidney for cash idea was not that I thought that kind of the ideal exchange was so unacceptable, but I really wasn't sure if I liked the way that people might behave under a system where such a thing is legal. Could that be part of the repugnance phenomenon?
Absolutely. So many markets that we find repugnant, there's also other things we don't like about them. So it's not simple repugnance, and sometimes repugnance is just used to recruit allies. So in the long lists I gave you, there are certainly markets that have externalities, for example. So you might object to prostitution not because you find prostitution repugnant, but because you think it's associated with crime or with human trafficking or with a lot of the things that prostitution seems to be associated with. You might, you could object to selling kidneys because you're concerned that if it were legal to sell kidneys, when you went to get a mortgage on your house, the banker would say to you, you're well employed, you qualify for the best rate, just check here, and that'll assure that you can get the best rate. And you say, check here, it says, you can collect my kidney. Well, so there are a lot of objections that are associated with this. The people who are in favor of markets, people like Gary Becker at the University of Chicago, I think would answer that by saying, make a list of the things you don't want, and we'll keep them against the law. It's already against right now it's against the law to sell kidneys. We can make it against the law to write a contract about a kidney. We could make it against the law to sell a kidney to anyone except one national buyer. We could, et cetera, et cetera. So I think as the debate goes on between people who don't want markets for kidneys and people who do, the irreducible part is the repugnance. Often everything else we can talk about.
So, Al, I was very inspired by the cartoon and by the talk. I'd like to take you out to a free dinner at Charlie's.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.